Okay, now let's continue our chapter 5 true-false problems. So we finished the first 5 problems. Today let's start from problem 6. If a demand is perfectly inelastic, then the demand curve is vertical and elasticity is equal to 0. Um, well, we could verify that this is actually correct. So if this is the demand curve, right, it is vertical, and you can see that in this case the the quantity is fixed. So according to the definition of elasticity, so basically elasticity equals percentage change in quantity divided by the percentage change in price. And because quantity is fixed, so the numerator is always 0. So the elasticity is equal to 0. Seventh, when demand is inelastic, a decrease in price increases total revenue. Well, we basically talk about this, right? If a demand is inelastic, then the price changes in the same direction as total revenue. So if a price decreases, then total revenue should decrease. So this is incorrect. Eighth, a linear demand curve has constant elasticity, but not constant slope. This is incorrect. The correct statement is a linear demand curve has constant slope, but not constant elasticity. Ninth, a linear demand curve becomes more elastic as price falls. Well, this is incorrect because we have learned in the lecture note a demand curve becomes more elastic as price increases. 10th, when the price of knee braces increased by 25%, the firm increased their quantity supplied by 75%. So the price elasticity of supply is 0.33. Well, this is not correct because according to the definition of the price elasticity of supply, you should use the percentage change in quantity supplied divided by the percentage change in price. So here the price elasticity of supply equals to 75% divided by 25%, which equals 3. If a supply curve is horizontal, it is said to be perfectly elastic, and the price elasticity of supply approaches infinity. This one is correct. And if you want to know why, you can check the lecture note because we have an exact picture which shows you the supply curve is horizontal and the price elasticity of supply equals infinity. 12th, a government program that reduces land under cultivation hurts farmers but helps consumers. Well, this problem needs some thinking here. So let's draw out the supply and demand curve. Right? So this is the demand, this is the supply. And now the government reduces land supply. And clearly, land supply is an input to farmers, right? So in this case, you can see that if the amount of land reduces, then the supply curve should shift to the left. So this is the new supply curve. And clearly, because of this government policy, price should increase. And we know that, or by assumption, we know that demand curve for food, for farm products, is inelastic. So in this case, that if price increases, then total revenue increases. This basically means that this program will make farmers richer, but consumers, they have to pay more for those farm products. So in this case, this program hurts consumers but helps farmers. 13th, OPEC failed to maintain a high price of oil in the long run because both the supply and the demand are more elastic in the long run than in the short run. This one is correct, and it's the exact result we have got from the lecture note. So I will skip this one and directly give you the answer. Drug interdiction, which reduces the supply of drugs, may decrease drug-related crimes because the demand for drug is inelastic. Reduces the supply of drugs. This statement is correct. Demand for drugs is inelastic. This statement is also correct. However, decrease drug-related crime. This is not correct. Again, this is the exact problem we have talked about in the lecture note. The idea, the explanation here is drug interdiction reduces the supply of drug, which increases the price of drug. And because demand for drugs is inelastic, so the total revenue from drugs is higher. This implies that drug addicts have to pay more for drugs, which implies that drug-related crime would increase. Okay, that's for chapter 5. So now let's proceed to chapter 6. And chapter 6 is about applying what we have learned, supply-demand elasticity, to analyze government policies. We would basically talk about two kinds of policies. The first is about price control. The second is about taxes. Okay, so let's start from the price control. There are basically two kinds of price controls. The first one is price ceiling. The second one is price floor. Just from the names, you could easily understand what is this price ceiling and what is this price floor is about. So basically, price ceiling says, okay, there's a ceiling of price, which means that the price cannot be higher than this price ceiling. So price ceiling is essentially a maximum on the price at which a product can be sold. An example is rent control. So to give you an example, just assume, let's say, the city of Winnipeg says the highest possible or the price ceiling for a two-bedroom, two-bathroom apartment for rent is $1,000. This implies that the highest possible price these two-bedroom, two-bathroom apartments can be rented out is $1,000, right? So if you want to rent it for $1,200, then it is impossible because you're in violation of this price ceiling control law. The second one is price floor. It's a minimum on the price at which a product can be sold. The example for price floor is minimum wage. So if you consider your labor as a product, then this minimum wage essentially gives you a price floor at which you could sell your labor. Say, for example, let's assume the minimum wage in Manitoba is, let's say, $15. Then it basically means that as a worker, you can never sell your labor below $15 per hour. Okay, now let's consider how price ceilings would affect the market outcomes. Here, market outcomes refer to market price and market quantity. So let's say we are looking at the market for ice cream cones. Now let's assume the government imposes a price ceiling. There are two possible results if a price ceiling is imposed. The first is the price ceiling is actually higher than the equilibrium price. The second one is the price ceiling is actually lower than the equilibrium price. So let's see what kind of equilibrium price and equilibrium quantities we can get under these two scenarios. So for graph A, we could see that the price ceiling is actually higher than equilibrium price, right? in this case, you can see that if a price ceiling is at $4, then the equilibrium price of 3 satisfies this requirement, right? Because it is below $4. So $3 is not in violation of this price control policy. So basically it means the market price will stay at $3. So in this case, you can see that the price ceiling is not binding, right? So to summarize, if a price ceiling is larger than equilibrium price, then the price ceiling is not binding, and the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity will stay the same. Now let's look at the second case. So the second case is we have a price ceiling which is binding. So you can see that here the equilibrium price is still $3 and the price ceiling is $2. So price ceiling is lower than equilibrium price. In this case, you could see that the $3 equilibrium price is in violation of this price control policy. So which implies that in the end, the market cannot have this $3 price. In the end, the market could only have the highest possible price within this price control policy, right? That is $2. So in the end, the market price will become $2. And now you could see that because $2 is smaller than the equilibrium price, and we have learned about this, if this happens, there would be shortage, right? Which is the case that quantity demanded is larger than quantity supplied. So here you can see that you have some number here. At the price of 2, quantity demanded becomes 125 and quantity supplied becomes 75. So there's a shortage of 50 units. So to summarize here, if a price ceiling is lower than the market equilibrium price, then the price setting will be binding and a shortage will happen. Okay, now let's look at one interesting example. So we have learned in the last chapter that in 1973, the OPEC raised the price of oil in the world. And this increased the gas price in both Canada and in the US. And in Canada, the price of gas increased, but there were very few shortages. But in the US, it was very different. There were long lines at the gas stations because drivers, they just could not buy their gas. So there were wide spreads of shortage in the US back in 1970s. Now, why we could observe this kind of difference, right? So why there were long lines in the US? So here we have two graphs which give you this very intuitive explanation. So let's see the graph on this left-hand side, right? So let's call this graph as before 1973. And this is the case after 1973. So before 1973, there was no demand, before 1973, there was no supply shock. So the supply curve stays at this place. And the price was P1, which is below the price ceiling. So in this case, we know that the price ceiling imposed by US government was not binding. So everything was fine. Market was in equilibrium. There were no shortages, right? Now let's say after 1973, the price ceiling imposed by the US government stays the same. But now, because of the supply shock created by the OPEC, we would see that the supply curve shifts to the left. And you can see that the oil price increased a lot, right? So it increased from P1 to P2. Right? So this is the original equilibrium. And after the supply shock created by OPEC, we have a equilibrium here. In this case, you can see that if price ceiling stays the same, then what you get here is the equilibrium, right? The equilibrium has moved. That is, the equilibrium price changed from P1 to P2. So you can see that now, because of the movement of the equilibrium, then price ceiling became lower compared with the market equilibrium price of P2. So in this case, there would be shortages. So that's why you could see that the quantity demanded is larger than quantity supplied. And that's also why you would see large or long lines of drivers in the US waiting for gas back in 1970s. Oh, we have another example. So now let's talk about rent control, right? So basically, if you look at policies in Canada, some forms of rent control exists in a lot of provinces, right? In Ontario, Quebec, BC, Manitoba. So the goal of the policy is to help the poor by making housing more affordable. However, let's see what's the result of this rent control policy on housing price and rent units supplied and the rent units demanded. So here you can see that on the left-hand side, we are looking at rent control in the short run. Okay? We have learned in the previous chapters that in the short run, supply and demand are less elastic. Or you could say in the long run, both supply and demand would become more elastic. The reason is because consumers and the producers, they need more time to make some adjustment. So if they have longer time, then they could make larger adjustments. So this implies that demand and supply would be more elastic in the long run. So on graph A, on the left-hand side picture, you could see that it's the short run case. In the short run, you can see that the supply is vertical and the demand is inelastic. So it's actually intuitive to consider why supply is vertical, because we're talking about the supply of apartment buildings, right? So basically, as a apartment building supplier, that's a bad name. As a landlord, right? You cannot increase your apartment buildings overnight because you have to build it. So possibly you need 1 year to build a whole block of apartment buildings, right? So basically, you could consider that in the short run, the supply for apartment housing is just fixed. Now, you can see that if in the short run, supply and demand are inelastic, you can see that this is the equilibrium price, right? So a binding rent control should impose a price which is below the market equilibrium price. In this case, you can see that we will only have a small shortage, right? The shortage is relatively very mild. So you have a lower rental price and shortage is also very small. So you can see that in the short run, possibly this is a good policy to help the poor to obtain affordable housing, right? Now let's see the right-hand side. in the right-hand side, we're thinking about what would happen to the rent control in the longer term. So in the long run, you can see that both supply and demand would become more elastic. Again, I want to remind you that if a curve is flatter, then it is more elastic, right? So in this case, you can see that because both supply and demand become more elastic, what you could observe here is the shortage becomes larger, right? So the rent control, this price floor is the same. Sorry, this price ceiling is the same, but shortage becomes much larger, right? So this basically tells you that a policy, which could be good policy in the short run, it could become a bad policy in the long run. Because in this case, you can imagine that even if there is this low housing, this low rental price, but renters will have a very hard time to obtain this low cost housing because there is widespread shortage. Okay, now let's talk about the second price control policy, which is price floor. So, well, we have finished this previous part about price ceiling. So now it's actually pretty easy to understand price floor. So let's again talk about two cases. The first case is the price floor is below the market equilibrium price. You can see here the equilibrium price is $3 and the price floor is $2. So you can see that in this case, price floor is not binding. Why it is not binding? Because according to definition, price floor is the minimum price the product can be sold, right? And since the market equilibrium price is $3, so the market equilibrium price already satisfies the price floor policy. So the price floor here is not binding. Then market price and market quantity would stay the same. Now let's look at the right-hand side picture. So we're looking at a price floor which is binding. Why it is binding? Because now the price floor increases to $4 and price floor is the minimum price the product can be sold. So the equilibrium price of $3 violates the price floor policy, which means in this case, the market price will increase to $4. And in this case, you could see that because $4 is above the equilibrium price, then there would be some surplus, right? That is, at a high price, quantity supplied would be larger than quantity demanded. Okay, now let's see the example of minimum wage. So, supposedly, minimum wage is a good policy to help workers because it guarantees you that you will get a decent wage. And here you can see that minimum wage policy in Canada is actually widely adopted, right? You could see that Manitoba has this $11 minimum wage, and almost every province, I guess it's every province and territories in Canada have this minimum wage policy, right? So what's the effect of minimum wage? Well, let's analyze this using this classic demand supply curve, right? So first, we're looking at a free labor market. That is a labor market without minimum wage. So we're looking at the equilibrium wage and equilibrium and equilibrium employment. Now let's say the government imposes this minimum wage, and let's assume this is an effective minimum wage. That is, it's binding. So here the minimum wage has to be larger than the equilibrium wage. And you can see that in this case, surplus will happen if the minimum wage is binding, right? Basically, it means that the wage is high. So firms, they don't like high wages. They will reduce their hiring. And workers, they're happy with hiring. So they will actually increase their labor supply. Or you could imagine that more people will want to work. More people will want to find a job. So in this case, the quantity supplied, the labor quantity supplied is larger than labor quantity demanded. So there will be labor surplus. Then what does labor surplus mean? Well, it is unemployment. So basically the result here is in a competitive market, if we impose a binding minimum wage, then there will be more or higher unemployment. I would emphasize that this is a theoretical result. And this theoretical result only holds in the competitive market. In the future, we will learn different kinds of markets. If it's a monopoly market, then this result will be different. And since we're in an introductory course, everything you learn here is based on simple theory. So you should only believe in these theories with some sort of doubt. Because when you're actually trying to understand the economy, when you're trying to understand the world, you need two tools. The first tool is theory. The second tool is evidence. So here in this introductory course, you're only learning about theory. You have not learned about any evidence. So every time if you want to analyze a economic policy in a rigorous way, you have to look at both theory and evidence. So what's the evidence on how minimum wage affect the labor market? Well, I'm not a labor economist, so I cannot give you a definitive answer, but there were a lot of controversies and there was a lot of research. So if you're interested, you could ask me and I could possibly direct you some interesting research. Okay. Now let's summarize, right? So basically, we could see that price control generally have negative effect, right? Why? Well, it's really because competitive market is generally a good way to organize economic activities, right? And market price is important because it has this effect of balancing supply and demand. It makes the market stay in equilibrium. And when policymakers start to regulate prices by using price controls, then they will actually harm the process of how price balances supply and demand. So there would be either surpluses or there would be shortages. Market will be in this off equilibrium state. Okay, now let's look at this example here. So this is a problem of price control, and it's actually pretty simple. So we are looking at the market for hotel rooms. So we want to understand the effect of price ceiling, $90, price floor, $90, $120 price floor. So let's look at the first one, right? The $90 price ceiling. So first we know that the equilibrium price is actually $100. So let's draw out this price ceiling. So this is the $90 price ceiling. According to the definition of price ceiling, the hotel room price cannot be higher than $90, which means in the end, the market would stay at this $90 price. So in this case, we will have shortages, right? We would see that the quantity demanded would be 120 and the quantity supplied would be 90. So in the first case, we will have a shortage of 30, right? 30 rooms. Now, price floor. $90 price floor. You can see that the $100 market price satisfies this price floor. So this is not, so the $90 price floor is not binding. In this case, we could see that the market stays in equilibrium. Now, $120 price floor. So let me first draw this price floor. Right? So it's 120. So here you can see that the equilibrium price is actually below this price floor, which means the $120 price floor will become binding. So in this case, the market price will be equal to 120, and then we would see surplus, right? So we would see a surplus of how many units? 120, and quantity demanded would be 60. So we would see a surplus of 60. Okay, quick quiz. Define price ceiling and price floor and give an example of each. Well, price ceiling is really the maximum price the product can be sold, and price floor is the minimum price a product can be sold. Giving an example of each, well, we have talked about several examples, right? For example, for price ceiling, we could talk about rent control. For price floor, we could talk about minimum wage, which leads to a shortage, which leads to a surplus, and why? Well, we know that for this minimum wage, we learned that there would be some surplus, right? For rent control, we know that there would be some shortage. So we could say that price ceiling would learn to, we'll need to shortage. And we could say that price floor will lead to surplus. Is this correct? Well, it's not entirely correct. Remember, you have to add this modifier, right? We need binding price floor and binding price ceiling. So the correct answer is a binding price ceiling will lead to shortage, and a binding price floor will lead to a surplus. As to why, well, it's really because if a price ceiling is binding, then the price ceiling has to be smaller than equilibrium price. Right? And if a price floor is binding, then it is larger than the equilibrium price. And when a price is smaller than equilibrium price, then there would be shortage. And if a price is larger than equilibrium price, then there would be surplus, right? So this will lead to surplus, and this will lead to shortage. Okay, now let's talk about the second policy. It's about taxes. So we are basically talking about sales taxes. And I can imagine this is an important topic, right? Because taxes is like universal. It's in everywhere, right? When you get your wage, you have to pay income taxes. When you're shopping at Save On Foods, you have to pay sales tax. Right? Okay, so let's start with a simple example. So let's say Winnipeg decides to hold an annual ice cream festival. So to pay this festival, the city decides to place a 50-cent tax on ice cream cones. And now there are two potential parties to pay this tax, right? You could ask sellers to pay the tax, or you could ask the buyers to pay the tax. So you can see that potentially there could be some arguments, because sellers would say that, well, our business is not that good, so we don't want to pay that, so maybe buyers of ice cream cones should pay the tax. Then the buyers could claim that, well, as buyers, we are already having trouble in supporting our family in this bad economy, so the sellers should pay the tax. Now let's assume the city mayor who hopes to reach a compromise. So he says that, okay, let's divide the tax equally. So 50% of the tax would be paid by the buyers and 50% would be paid by the sellers. So now our question is, so when the government imposes a tax, who bears the burden of the tax, right? Will people buy the good to bear the tax, or people who sell the good bear the tax? Or maybe buyers and sellers, they will actually share the tax burden. Then in this case, how this tax burden sharing is determined, right? So we're essentially asking about the question of tax incidence. That is, how the burden of tax is divided, is shared between buyers and sellers. Now let's start with the first case. Let's assume the tax is imposed entirely on buyers, right? So in this ice cream example, basically the government says ice cream buyers have to pay entirely the $0.5 sales tax. Now let's see how this would affect the market supply and market demand. So let me see if I could find some place to draw this curve. Okay, I'll draw it here. So let's say this is the ice cream market, right? We have the demand and supply here. Now, the government says, okay, as a buyer, you have to pay this $0.5 tax. Now, which curve should be affected, right? Should this policy affect the demand curve or the supply curve? Well, the tax is imposed on consumers, so this should affect demand curve. Second, how should demand curve change? Well, in this case, the demand curve should shift to the left. What is the distance of the shift? Well, the vertical distance of the shift should be exactly $0.5. Now, if the shift of the demand curve here is correct, now let's see what would happen to the equilibriums. In the beginning, the equilibrium was here, and after the tax, equilibrium would be here, right? Now, let's see how quantity would change. Well, obviously, quantity demanded or the equilibrium quantity will decrease. Now, how price will change? Right? Let's see how price will change. So, previously, the equilibrium price was here. Let me put some, okay, I'll just copy the number from the lecture. Let's say the original equilibrium price was $3. And after the tax law, after this additional $0.5 tax, then you can see that, let's assume this is 2.8, and I will have a different number. Let's assume this is 3.3. And after the tax law, we will have actually two prices. So the $2.8, right? The $2.8 is the price charged by sellers. And this $3.3 is the price paid by buyers. So why we have two different prices? Well, this is because the buyers, they have to pay this additional $0.5 tax, right? So essentially in the end, you can see that the sellers, they will get $2.8, and the buyers, they have to pay $2.8 for the ice cream and $0.5 for the tax, a total of $3.3, right? Now, the important thing here is you can see that the $0.5 tax is actually shared by the buyers and the sellers. Even the government says buyers should pay the tax. How can you see the tax is shared? Well, it's because originally the price was $3. And after imposing the tax, the buyers, they're paying additional $0.3, right? And the sellers, the price they could receive reduces by $0.2. So you can see that there is a division of tax between buyers and sellers, right? Okay, great. Now let's use this nicer picture, and let me go through this process for a second time. First, you can see that if there is tax of $0.5 imposed on buyers, then the demand curve should shift to the left, and the distance of shift would be $0.5. Right? So you can see that the distance should be $0.5. Next, what you could see here is previous equilibrium price was $3, and after imposing the tax, the price sellers receive would be 2.8. The price buyers pay would be 3.3. Why do we see two different prices? Well, because there is a tax of $0.5 coming out of buyers' pockets. Now, how do we know tax is shared? The reason is because the prior price was $3, and after imposing the tax, the buyers, they have to pay this additional $0.3. And the sellers, the price they receive reduces by $0.2. So this is a sharing of price, right? Okay, great. Now let's see the other case. Let's assume the city of Winnipeg says, well, sellers should pay entirely the $0.5 ice cream tax. Now in this case, you could possibly imagine that you should shift this supply curve. Because now tax dollars come out of sellers' pockets, then the supply curve should shift to the left. And again, you can see here that the distance, the vertical distance of shift should be the amount of tax, $0.5. Now you can see that we would have two equilibrium points. The prior equilibrium price was $3. And after this policy, we have a different equilibrium point. We have a different equilibrium point. And you can see that because of the tax, then buyers, they will pay $3.3 to the sellers. On the surface, sellers will receive $3.3. However, they have to pay $0.5 tax. So in the end, sellers will only receive $2.8. And you can see here that, again, the tax is shared, right? It's actually the same result as the prior example. You can see that the buyers, they pay additional $0.3, and the sellers, the price they receive reduces by $0.2. Now, if you compare these two cases, right, a tax on buyers would shift the demand curve. A tax on sellers would shift the supply curve. However, you can see that the price and the quantity are the same, right? Under both cases, buyers, they have to pay additional $3. And under both cases, the price received by sellers decreases by $0.2. And you can see that in the first case, right, the tax dollars come out of buyers' pockets. And in the second case, tax dollars come out of sellers' pockets. That's the only difference here. But in the end, the price buyers pay and the price sellers receive, they're the same. And more importantly, the division of tax, the tax incidence under both cases, right? They're the same. Okay. So let me summarize. So basically taxes on buyers and taxes on sellers, they have the same result on market equilibrium and on market price and quantities. So in both cases, the tax places a wedge. So I like this word, right? It's a wedge between the price that buyers pay and the price that sellers receive. So why we have a wedge here? This is actually fairly intuitive graphically. So it is a wedge. Let me draw out this wedge. Right? This is the wedge we're talking about, right? There is a wedge between 3.3 and 2.8, right? The same thing happens to this case, that is a tax on buyers. So we're having a wedge here, right? And depending on the policy, depending on who pays the tax, the only difference is tax on buyers and tax on sellers. The only difference is who sends the money to the government, right? That is, whose pockets the tax dollars will come from, right? If the tax is imposed on buyers, then tax come out of buyers' pockets. Tax on sellers, then tax dollars come out of sellers' pockets. Okay, and you can see that under two cases, tax reduces equilibrium quantity, and tax decreases market activity. In the future, you will see that after learning about the efficiency of market, you will see that tax actually reduces market efficiency. So tax will create losses. Okay, now let's go one step deeper. And we want to understand how exactly the tax burden divided. Well, because we have learned it does not matter who pays the tax. In the end, tax will be shared. However, we don't know who will share a larger burden, right? Would the buyers share a larger burden or would sellers share a larger burden? So that's the question here. So in the end, sorry. So in the end, how the tax burden is shared depends on the elasticity of the demand curve and the supply curve. So let's see two cases. The first case is we have elastic supply curve and we have inelastic demand curve. Again, how do you know supply curve is elastic? Well, because you can see that in this case, supply curve is quite flat. Now, how do you know that demand curve is inelastic? Well, because you can see here that the demand curve is quite steep, right? So we know that a steeper curve is less elastic. Now, in this case, so let's start from the original market equilibrium, which is given by this point. And now let's see what happens if we impose a tax. Remember that tax, right? Tax creates a wedge between the price buyers pay and the price sellers receive. And the size or the length of the wedge is the size of the tax. So here you can see that we're exactly doing this. That is, we're drawing out this wedge, right? So here you can see that buyers, they share a larger tax burden compared with sellers, right? Because this is the portion of the tax shared by buyers, and this is the portion of the tax shared by sellers, right? Now let's see the second case. So in the second case, we have inelastic supply and elastic demand, because you can see that demand is actually flatter compared with the supply curve. And now what you can see here is, again, we have a wedge, which is the size of the tax. And you can see that the portion of the tax, or the size of the tax, shared by buyer is given by this. And the portion of tax paid by seller is given by this. And you can see that in this case, in this case, sellers are paying a large portion of tax, right? So what you can conclude here, basically the conclusion here is, in the first case, demand is inelastic, so buyers share a large tax burden. In the second case, supply is inelastic, so suppliers share a larger tax burden. So the result is the tax burden falls more heavily on the side of the market which is less elastic, right? So what's the intuition here? Well, think about why. Okay, let's assume demand is inelastic, right? So why demand is inelastic? Well, possibly it's because consumers, they don't have other choices. So that's why they're not sensitive to price changes in the market. So if they don't have other choices, this implies that if there is a tax, then the side with fewer choices have to bear a larger burden, right? So that's the intuition here. Okay, let's see this quick quiz here. In a supply and demand diagram, show how a tax on car buyers of $1,000 per car affects the quantity of cars sold and the price of cars. In another diagram, show how a tax on car sellers of $1,000 per car affects the quantity of cars sold and the price of cars. And in both of your diagrams, show the change in price paid by car buyers and the change in price received by car sellers. Okay, so, oops, I don't have any space here. That's bad. Okay, let me draw it here. Okay, so basically we are thinking about two scenarios, right? The first case is the tax is imposed on car buyers. The second case is the tax is imposed on car sellers. I mean, we're talking about the car market, but the graph should be exactly the same as graphs in the ice cream market. But anyway, let's solve this problem, and we could practice with these tax policies. So let's say this is the original demand and supply curve. And now, tax imposed on buyers. So we should shift the demand curve. And now the original price is, oops, let me remove this. And the original price was given by, let's call it P, I don't know. Let's just call this as P. And after shifting the curve, we will have two prices. This is the price received by seller, and then tax creates a wedge. So this is the price paid by the buyers. So let's call this as PS, represents price received by sellers. And this is PB, that is price paid by buyers. And then you can see that this portion, right? This portion is tax. And in this case, tax comes out of the buyer's pockets. And we can see that initially, the equilibrium quantity was here, right, given by Q. And after this tax policy, equilibrium quantity decreases. And you can see that equilibrium quantity is given by Q prime. Right? So basically, equilibrium quantity decreases, and we could see that the price of seller decreases and the price paid by buyers increases. And again, you can see that tax is shared. Okay, now let's see the second case. So in the second case, we are talking about a tax which is imposed on sellers. In this case, you can see that in the beginning, we have equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. And after imposing a tax on sellers, we would move supply curve to the left, right? So in this case, you can see that again, we will have a wedge generated by the tax, and then we will have two prices. So PS, which is the price received by sellers, and PB, price paid by buyers. And again, this wedge is the amount of tax, right? And in this case, you can see that buyers are paying a higher price, and sellers, they are receiving a lower price because now tax comes out of sellers' pockets, right? And again, you could see that equilibrium quantity decreases to Q prime. Okay. And the third question is, in both of your diagrams, show the change in the price paid by car buyers and change in price received by car sellers. This is pretty simple, right? You can see that for the first graph, this is the change of the price paid by buyers. And this is the change of the price received by car sellers. The same on the left-hand side, right? This is the change in buyer's price. This is the change in seller's price. And you can see that in two graphs, it seems that buyers and sellers, the tax burden are, it seems that the tax burden is equally divided among buyers and sellers. Well, this is because if you look at the supply curve and demand curve, roughly speaking, they have the same sort of elasticity, right? Because the steepness of these two supply curve and demand curves, they're the same, right? So they roughly have the same elasticity. And if supply curve and demand curve have the same elasticity, then the tax burden should be equally divided. Of course, this is really an artifact of how I draw these supply curves and demand curves. If I make the supply curves more like, let's say, more vertical, then in this case, you could see that sellers, they will bear a larger portion of the tax. Okay, great. That's for chapter 6. So let's move on to chapter 6, true-false problem. So first, if a price ceiling of $2 per liter is imposed on gas, but the market equilibrium price is 1.5, then price ceiling is a binding constraint. Now, to solve this, you have to remember the definition of price ceiling, right? So in this case, you can see that price ceiling of 2 is larger than the market equilibrium price, right? What is the definition of price ceiling? It's the maximum price you can sell, right? And you can see that in this case, the market equilibrium price 1.5 satisfies this price ceiling, which implies price ceiling in this case is not binding. So this is incorrect. This is false. Okay, second, if a price ceiling is not binding, it will have no effect on the market. We basically talk about this. That is, if the price ceiling is not binding, the market equilibrium price and market equilibrium quantity would stay the same. So this is equivalent to say it will have no effect on the market, right? So this is correct. Okay. If the price ceiling is below equilibrium price, the quantity demanded will exceed the quantity supplied. So here you can see that if the price ceiling is below the equilibrium price, in this case, you can see that the price ceiling will become binding, right? So it's a binding price ceiling. In this case, if you draw this supply and demand, you see that a binding price ceiling will be below the market equilibrium price. So you can see that in this case, the market price will be too low. So quantity demanded, which is here, will be larger than quantity supplied. So the third statement is correct. Binding price ceiling benefit consumers because they allow consumers to buy all goods they demand at a lower price. Well, this is actually not correct because it says consumers can buy all the goods they demand. They cannot buy all the goods because we have learned that, just from problem 3, right? We know that if price ceiling is binding, quantity demanded is larger than quantity supplied. So this implies there will be shortage in the market. What does shortage mean here? Well, it surely means that some consumers, they won't be able to buy products they want, right? Even the price is low. So you can see that here this one is incorrect. Fifth, if the equilibrium wage is $4 per hour and the minimum wage is 4.15 per hour, a shortage of labor. Well, minimum wage is a price floor, right? So in this case, 5.15 is larger than the equilibrium wage rate of $4, which means this is a binding price floor. So we could draw out this. So if we have a binding price floor, then it will be above the equilibrium price. In this case, you could see that quantity supplied will be larger than quantity demanded. So we will see surplus. So basically, the statement is not correct. We will not see a shortage. We will see a surplus of labor. That is, you will see unemployment. Sixth, a binding minimum wage in a competitive labor market creates unemployment. Oh, we just talked about this, right? So this is correct. Economists use the term tax incidence to refer to those that are legally responsible paying the tax. Well, this is not correct because we know that tax incidence refers to how tax burden is divided between buyers and sellers. If a tax is imposed on the buyer, then tax incidence will fall entirely on the buyer, causing the buyer to pay more. Causing the buyer to pay more is correct, but falls entirely on the buyer. Well, it does not hold, right? We talked about this. Even if you impose the ice cream tax on buyers, then in the end, the tax burden will still be shared by buyers and sellers. Okay, ninth. A tax on golf clubs will cause the equilibrium market price of golf clubs to increase and equilibrium quantity sold to decrease. Well, this is actually correct, right? So let's say if this is the market, then the initial equilibrium is here. After imposing a tax, then you can see that the price will be here and the quantity will be here. So the price will basically the statement is the equilibrium market price of golf clubs will increase and the equilibrium quantity will decrease. The statement that equilibrium quantity sold to decrease is correct. However, the market price of golf clubs to increase is not correct because we basically have two prices. So if you're in this case, right, then you would see that the market price will actually decrease. So this is incorrect. Okay. The incidence of a tax depends on whether the tax is levied on buyers or sellers. Again, we talk about this. No matter how the tax is levied, in the end, according to the elasticity, the tax will be shared. Oh, this should be incorrect. Who pays the majority of the tax levied on a product depends on whether the tax is placed on the buyer or the seller. This is not correct, right? Because we learned the majority of the tax will be levied on the side of the market with more inelastic curve. That is, if demand curve is more inelastic, then buyers will bear the majority of a tax. Similarly, if supply curve is more inelastic, then sellers will bear the majority of the tax. 12. In general, a tax burden falls more heavily on the side of the market that is more inelastic. Well, this is the statement we have made in the lecture note. So this is correct. Since half of the EI tax, EI here refers to employment insurance. So since half of the employment insurance tax is paid by firms and the other half is paid by workers, so the burden of the tax must fall equally on firms and workers. This is incorrect because we know that, again, it does not depend on how the tax is levied. It really only depends on the elasticity of the supply curve and the demand curve. Lawmakers can decide whether the buyer or the seller must send a tax to the government, but they cannot legislate the true burden of a tax. So this is correct, right? Again, we talk about this. So basically, the true burden of the tax is determined by elasticity, right? Okay, so this one is correct. Okay, so that's for today's class.